we go, is Flood Stories Around the World, Oral Histories, Knowledge Production, and Faith. So the story of the Great Flood recorded in Genesis 6 through 9 is familiar to Seventh-day Adventist children and adults alike. It's a foundational and familiar story with the building of the ark and the procession of the animals in 2 by 2, but it becomes difficult when we take the story seriously. Was there really a global flood? Did everyone but Noah and his family really die? Was the earth submerged in the flood? How much of our planet and earth history was changed in that short time, and how do we know? Behind these questions are questions of faith. Can we believe the Bible in a literal sense? Can we believe what we've seen and what we've heard there? How do we talk about the challenges of the story? And is it important now? Does the story really have anything to do with us in this moment? Today, through our conversation, I hope to provide an understanding of the breadth and diversity of flood stories around the world, and to offer practical approaches to teaching flood stories in the context of a global flood narrative recorded in Genesis. So I'm going to continue in 3 parts. First, we're going to examine several flood stories. So I'm going to be reading you some stories, which story time is one of my favorite, right? It's the best. Next, we'll consider processes of knowledge production, how we know what we know, and how these myths, oral histories, and narratives, while diverse, support the possibility of a global flood event. And last, we'll talk about teaching flood stories, how they connect Seventh-day Adventism to local and indigenous communities. So because so much of our conversation today centers on indigenous knowledge, I do want to begin by recognizing not only the individuals and communities who hold this knowledge, but also their enduring connection to land and to country. To acknowledge that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander owners of the land where we gather today, and to pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. We recognize your connection to country and role in caring for and maintaining country over thousands of years. May their strength and wisdom be with us today. And I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people and colleagues who are here with us today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for that. I'm honored to be with you. My name is Stacie Hatfield. I'm a cultural anthropologist at Andrews University in the United States. And anthropology across its multiple subfields is the study of human culture. I study human culture. There are cultural anthropology. There are 4 primary subfields within anthropology. These are divided up a little differently. In Europe, archaeology is sometimes separate. In some universities that are very large, linguistics might be a little separate. But the overarching is under the umbrella often of anthropology. Archaeology is a study of human culture in the past, largely understood as the exciting work of excavating and analyzing artifacts. Linguistic anthropologists study human culture through language, how language is situated and operates not only within human minds, but also between individuals and groups. Physical or biological anthropologists study culture and what it means to be human through the human body. This includes bioarchaeological work to understand previous life ways through an analysis of human skeletal remains. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. And through the highly technical genetic work of unraveling histories of human migration and biological change. Evolutionary understandings of human origins are often researched within physical anthropology. So if you're talking about archaic hominins, if we're talking about Neanderthal, if we're talking about very ancient, possibly pre-human bones, that's an evolutionarily based aspect of physical anthropology. Though physical anthropologists have also made vital contributions to our understandings of race as being a cultural rather than a biological phenomenon. And many individuals who work in forensics are also physical anthropologists. And a plug for any of you who have students who are particularly interested in this, we are very few cultural anthropologists in Adventism. It's just not a discipline that the church needs for its schools and churches and administration. So anytime I run into someone who's a cultural anthropologist, I'm like, oh, please come sit by me. What is your email address? We need to be friends and stay in touch. As far as I know, we have no physical anthropologist in Adventism. So as much as we need geologists, as much as we need microbiologists and biologists, in the secular world, these are evolutionary fields. Of course they are. But we still have students studying these fields. We still have students who go on to get advanced degrees and to help us to understand these worlds. And we are in desperate need of someone to go into physical anthropology, and it's not a light task. It's not a light task. It is entirely evolutionarily based. But as far as I know at this moment, we have no one from a position of faith engaging with these concepts. So we are in great need of study there. And we are indebted also, like I said, through forensics, also very, very much through our understandings of race. That race is not situated in our biology, even though our biology does determine kind of what color our skin is and what texture our hair is and the various things that make up race. How we understand those things is culturally situated. The power differentials that happen are culturally situated. Race is a culturally situated rather than a biological thing. And we are greatly indebted to physical anthropologists for that. So that's part of the important work that they do. But I'm a cultural anthropologist. I study human culture in the present. My research includes studies of intersections of race and gender in the United States, and gender and community and archaeology in Jordan. I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm an ethnographer. My approach to anthropological inquiry is critical interpretive, and what this means is that the famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz said you have to understand culture from the inside. You can look at it from the outside, but unless you're someone who lives in that culture, you don't know the meanings of what's going on. You can't even understand a basic joke often. When somebody winks at you, you don't know if they've got a flick in their eye or if they're making fun of you, unless you're on the inside. That's an interpretive approach. That you have to understand culture from the inside. The critical aspect of that does not mean that I'm picking away at things or causing trouble or, hopefully not excessively, or just being angry and grumpy at things. The critical aspect theoretically means that it requires its researchers, its theorists, to be attentive to power differentials in the world, to how power operates, and to be very intentional about making the world a better place, even from a secular perspective. So that is the theoretical kind of perspective that I come to in the studies of anthropology. I'm also a Seventh-day Adventist, a student of scriptures, and indebted always to the grace and mercy of our Lord. Now, it's important for you to know these things about me in order to understand my approach to this topic. I work to understand them from an insider's perspective. Though as a white, middle-class, middle-aged, cisgender American woman, I am often an outsider to the cultures and experiences I'm trying to understand. So ethnography is therefore a vitally important method. Through talking with people, by spending extended periods of time with them, through hearing and understanding the interpretations of their experiences, I, as an anthropologist, can gather data about how culture shapes our social worlds and about how we create and change culture. As a believer, speaking and learning with others broadens my understandings of the vastness of God and his work on our planet with us and with the people and communities who share it. So I'm delighted to examine world flood stories with you today. It's a subject that's filled textbooks, so we won't have time to go into all of the intricacies, but we'll have just enough time to do a few things. And I want to begin by sharing global flood stories with you. We're going to talk about these stories. So globally, there are more than 200 flood stories. They're separated by oceans, found on every continent, aside from Antarctica, and across diverse cultural groups. From Europe to the Middle East, to Africa and Australia, and from North and South America, stories of the flood are retained in well-known as well as obscure places. Now, the Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism know about the story of the flood. Christianity, we understand the story of the flood through our Bibles, but we received our Bibles through the Jewish tradition, through the Jewish faith. So people who are Jewish also have the flood story in the same way that we do. Islam also is derived along a similar sense, right? Ishmael was the brother of Isaac, sons of Abraham, who the Islamic people trace their heritage through. So they also have the story of that flood from that same historical story root, from that same one. And so when you combine those three faith traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we have about half of the world's population that already has in their cultural memory and in their theology an idea of the flood. But all of that goes back to a single story. So when you have a single story, we can say, well, yeah, but if Noah borrowed that from somebody else, or if somebody just made up this traditional story, it could get carried a long way through those three groups. So it's really important. It's actually really interesting and important to have these other stories. It makes a difference to know whether there are other stories, other oral histories, or myths of world flood events that could provide supporting evidence that are retained in cultural memory and that indicate a shared human experience. So the question is, yes, there are lots of stories. So in 2001, a survey of flood stories by John Morris and the Institute for Creation Research, he examined about 200 flood stories, and he found these similarities. So of the 200 flood stories that he looked at, about 88% of those stories had a favored family. The world had become evil, but there was a family that had found favor with God. There was forewarning. The human behavior was the cause of the flood, and about 66, what are we talking about? My lines are a bit off. Human behavior is a cause, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 66. Catastrophe, only a flood, 95%, global flooding in 95% of the 200 stories he looked at. Survival by a boat, 70%, that the animals were saved, that animals play a part. Geography was local, the landing of the flood, so there's an idea that this happened. This was a story that happened in a particular place. And in these stories that a bird was sent out, only about 35% of those stories include a bird. A rainbow is mentioned very rarely. The survivors offering a sacrifice, that's few, and the number of persons saved, that's a pretty specific detail, and it's not in as many of the stories. So our key features are that it has to do with local geography, it belongs to the story of those people, and that the catastrophe was by a flood, that there was evil in the world that caused this, that they were forewarned, and that the flood was catastrophic. So I find this is important. This is a very nice kind of summary of these stories that were looked at. And because there are a lot of flood stories, but of course, floods happen locally as well as the idea of a global flood. So many of the stories that are talked about as big floods may have been catastrophic, but were actually more local in area. So to try to figure out which stories might actually be talking about a global flood, which stories are probably talking about a more local event. But one of the most famous flood stories, and I want to bring you this flood story today. I want to bring you 3 stories. I'm going to try not to keep you too long, but I'm going to bring you 3 flood stories. This first is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's the oldest and best known in the secular world. The earliest Sumerian Gilgamesh poems date from as early as the 3rd dynasty of Ur. These poems mention Gilgamesh's journey to meet a flood hero, and the flood story was included because the flood hero, Utnapishtim, is granted immortality by the gods, and that fits the overall arc of the epic. This is from tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was found in Nineveh. It dates to the Neo-Assyrian period of the 7th century BCE. The writing is cuneiform, and this upper right, this is actually a picture of the tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, this 11 tablet. And the tablet is currently kept in the British Museum, as are many things. This translation is by Maureen Gallery Kovacs, and it reads as follows. So next slide. So what I want you to do is I'll give you these stories. I'm just going to give you one slide so that you can't spend too much time reading and reading. You can just listen to the story for a minute. So Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh a secret story that begins in the city of Shurappak on the banks of the Euphrates River. The great gods Anu, Enlil, Ninurti, Nguni, and Ea were sworn to secrecy about their plan to cause the flood. But the god Ea, the Sumerian god Enki, repeated the plan to Utnapishtim through a reed wall in a reed house. Ea commanded Utnapishtim to demolish his house and build a boat, regardless of the cost, to keep living beings alive. The boat must have equal dimensions with corresponding width and length and be covered over like Apsu boats. Utnapishtim promised to do what Ea commanded. He asked Ea what he should say to the city elders and the population, and Ea tells him that Enlil has rejected them, and he can no longer reside in the city or set foot in Enlil's territory. He should also say that he will go down to Apsu to live with my lord Ea. Carpenters, reed workers, and other people assembled one morning, and 5 days later, Utnapishtim laid out the exterior walls of the boat of 120 cubits. The sides of the superstructure had an equal length of 120 cubits. He also made a drawing of the interior structure. The boat had 6 decks divided into 7 and 9 compartments. Water plugs were drilled in the middle part, punting poles and other necessary things were laid in. 3 times 3,600 units of raw bitumen were melted in a kiln, and 3 times 3,600 units of oil were used in addition to 2 times 3,600 units of oil that were stored in the boat. Oxen and sheep were slaughtered, and ale and beer and oil and wine were distributed. When the boat was finished, the launch was very difficult. A runway of poles was used to slide the boat into the water. 2/3 of the boat was in the water. Utnapishtim loaded his silver and gold into the boat. He loaded all the living things that I had. His relatives and craftsmen and all the beasts and animals of the field boarded the boat. The time arrived, as stated by the god Shamash, to seal the entry door. Early in the morning, at dawn, a black cloud rose from the horizon. The weather was frightful. Utnapishtim boarded the boat and entrusted the boat and its contents to his boatmaster, Puzamari, who sealed the entry. The thunder god Adad rumbled in the cloud, and storm gods Shalat and Hanish went over the mountains and land. Erigel pulled out the mooring poles, and the dikes overflowed, and the Anaki gods lit up the land with their lightning. There was stunned shock at Adad's deeds, which turned everything to blackness. The land was shattered like a pot. All day long the wind blew rapidly, and the water overwhelmed the people like an attack. No one could see his fellows. They could not recognize each other in the torrent. The gods were frightened by the flood and retreated up to Anu heaven. They cowered like dogs laying in the outer wall. Ishtar shrieked like a woman in childbirth. The mistress of the gods wailed that the old days had turned to clay, because I said evil things in the assembly of the gods, ordering a catastrophe to destroy my people who fill the sea like fish. The other gods were weeping with her and sat sobbing with grief, their lips burning, parched with thirst. The flood and wind lasted 6 days and 6 nights, flattening the land. On the 7th day, the storm was pounding like a woman in labor. The sea calmed, and the whirlwind and floods stopped. All day long there was quiet. All humans had turned to clay. The terrain was as flat as a rooftop. Utnapishtim opened a window and felt fresh air on his face. He fell to his knees and sat weeping, tears streaming down his face. He looked for coastlines on the horizon and saw a region of land. The boat lodged firmly on Mount Nimush, which held the boat for several days, allowing no sway. On the 7th day, he released a dove that flew away but came back to him. He released a swallow, but it also came back to him. He released a raven that was able to eat and scratch and did not circle back to the boat. And he sent out his livestock in various directions. In this reading, we can see a number of elements that are similar to the Genesis account, but there are differences as well. The key differences have to do with the pantheon of gods, and that their gods were also frightened by the flood. These may represent differing positionalities among supernatural beings. It may reflect the personas of the cultural gods of Gilgamesh. But the Epic of Gilgamesh notes the flood as an act of God. It contains precise measurements for the boat. It brings the animals into the vessels. It tells of a terrifying and earth-changing event. It tells of birds sent from the ark. It's one of the earliest flood stories outside of the Abrahamic faiths, and it's an important one. So that's our first story from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the second story, there are quite a few creation stories that appear. That appear in Australian Aboriginal and oral history. These now include the story. There's a popularized story of a frog named Tiddalek. He caused the flood by drinking all the water and then spitting it out when made to laugh by the other animals. But the Bundamba flood story contains elements most familiar to the biblical narrative. And the Bundamba community is located just north of here. So you can see we've got a picture of Australia and Queensland there. And if you go up where Queensland's is, up to Turrbal here. You're getting toward the Boombamba part of area there near Brisbane. And so that's where the story is coming from. And of course there continues to be a community of people there. In 2021, there were 641 Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people living in Boombamba, in Bundamba. And this story was collected by Howard Coates and W.H. Douglas, as told by Jimmy Bird. This following picture is not a picture of Jimmy Bird, but it's a picture of someone from this group to kind of situate the story. So this story is not as long as the story of Gilgamesh, but I'll read it for you here. A long time ago, there was a great flood. It originated from the fact that some children found the winking owl in a tree and plucked out all its feathers. They forced a grass reed through its nose and treated the bird most shamefully. The bird flew without wings into the heavens and showed itself to Gowungo, the great father. Gowungo became very angry and decided to drown the people. Later, the people saw a small cloud rising, which grew bigger and bigger until it spread over the sky. The thunder began to roll and crash, and the people were greatly afraid. With the rain and thunder was a terrible wind, which broke great limbs off trees and rooted up others. During this terrible storm, there was a noise above the awful crashes of thunder. This noise was coming down from the north. The salt sea, the sea came pouring over the ranges from the north. The flood rose higher and higher till the land was covered except the tops of 2 or 3 mountains. From further west, a man and his wives with a dog were battling their way in a canoe, when a bird with a leaf in its mouth flew in front of them, showing them the way to Mount Broom. They eventually reached Mount Broom and landed where there were some other survivors. The Darjalgali, the great left-handed man, incised his little finger and let the blood trickle down into the floodwaters. The waters began to go down and eventually disappeared off the country. All the other people were drowned. So this story again contains the familiar elements: shameful behavior, an angry god, a great flood, a boat, a dog, a bird, a mountain, and the death of all but a few. Again, there are significant differences between the story and the Genesis story, but it comes from a place and was here before settler colonization from Europe began. This story was here before the missionaries, before the railroads, before cities and seaside conferences on faith and earth history. This story predates us. It was here before Western Christianity arrived in Australia. It has its own history, and so this story is important. The third story I want to share with you comes from the United States. This story comes from the Ojibwe, the Adawa, and the Potawatomi, indigenous nations of the Great Lakes. Most of the people of the Council of the Three Fires were forcibly removed from the Great Lakes region and relocated by the United States government. Members of the Potawatomi obtained the right to stay by negotiating difficult treaties and in part by converting to Catholicism. The Potawatomi tribe has tribal land and tribal headquarters in Dowagiac, Michigan, about 20 minutes by car from Andrews University. And the Potawatomi Band has about 38,000 tribal members. Andrews University is built on land that once belonged to the Potawatomi. And though my department chair, Harvey Burnett, is of Potawatomi heritage, we Adventists and Andrews University, as settler colonialists, are part of their displacement. And that's something that we should remember. The Andrews University was established in 1874. That was only about 41 years after the Treaty of 1833, which allowed the Potawatomi to remain on their land. So in 41 years, there would absolutely have been people at the time that Andrews was established who remembered that the Potawatomi had only recently gained the right, that was a contested right. So now it seems like a long time ago, but at the time, it would have been remembered that this new university is what used to be our land. So I'm going to share that story with us. Now, this story was told by Eddie Bennett Benet, and it begins in this way. Benton Benet. Although life was often hard for them, for many years the first people lived together in harmony with all creation. I regret to say that this harmonious way of life did not last forever. Men and women did not continue to give each other the respect needed to keep the sacred hoop of marriage strong. Families began quarreling with each other. Finally, villages began arguing back and forth. People began to fight over hunting grounds. Brother turned against brother and began killing each other. It greatly saddened the creator, Gitche Manito, to see the Earth's people turn to evil ways. It seemed that the entire creation functioned in harmony, except for the people who were the last to be placed there. For a long time, Gitche Manito waited, hoping that evil ways would cease and that brotherhood, sisterhood, and respect for all things would come to rule over the people. When it seemed there was no hope left, Gitche Manito decided to purify the earth. He would do this with water. The water came like a mushkebemun, flood on the earth. The flood came so fast that it caught the entire creation off guard. Most all living things were drowned immediately. But some of the animals were able to keep swimming, trying to find a small bit of land on which to rest. Some of the birds were caught in the air and had to keep flying in order to stay alive. The purification of the earth with water appeared to be complete. All the evil that had built up in the hearts of the first people had been washed away. He follows this then with a bit of a long story about the animals who are trying to figure out how do we get off this little log and find some earth. And finally, this feat is accomplished by a muskrat who dives very, very, very deep and arrives back at the surface drowned. He's died, but with a ball of dirt clutched in his fist. And the story continues. To this day, the ancestors of our brother, the muskrat, have been given a good life. No matter what marshes have been drained, their homes destroyed in the name of progress, the muskrat continues to multiply and live. If you're not familiar with a muskrat, it's a little rodent with a bit of a long tail, and it lives kind of on the edges and banks of rivers and wet areas. The Creator has made it so that the muskrats will always be with us because of the sacrifice that our little brother made for us all the many years ago when the earth was covered with water. The muskrat do their part today in remembering the great flood. They build their homes in the shape of the little ball of earth and the island that was formed from it. So this is actually a picture of Eddie Benton Benet, and he remembers this story in the book called the Mishoni, and it recounts old stories of the Ojibwe. This story, and particularly the recreating of the earth, is different from the other two in that most of the characters are animals. There's God, a creative God, an evil and a cleansing of the earth. The earth is destroyed, people and animals are lost in the deluge, but there is hope and there's restoration. So these myths are important. The elements shared between them and the traces of them left in our collective memories, they inform our understandings of who we are, where we come from, as well as possibilities for a God who moves and works in our world. They highlight the importance of oral history and storytelling as valid forms of research and knowledge production, and they prompt an appreciation of local and indigenous knowledge and the communities who carry these stories. So what we need to think about for just a minute is how we know what we know. So when we think about storytelling as a form of knowledge production, it's qualitative research. Some often rest in the shadow of quantitative research. People love numbers and graphs and things that seem complicated to understand. And I'm incredibly grateful for the scientific method and for scientific research. It has given us incredible technologies, but it's not everything. It can't do everything. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. And most of what we know, we actually know by authority. We know because someone we trust has told it to us. I know that World War I happened, not because I was there, but because my teachers told me. I know that the Egyptian pyramids exist, not because I've visited them, I haven't been to Egypt, but because I believe people have told me the story and it's true. I believe that my father is my father. Not because he's had paternity testing, but because my mom says that's my dad, and he agrees. So we know these things, much of what we knew, most of what we know in the world, we know by authority. So research, so we have scientific research, the scientific method, incredibly important, but it can't answer all questions. It can't tell us what these stories mean. Scientific research has not been able to solve the problems of racial difference and ethnic diversity and the tensions and the power struggles that causes. It can't tell us why we like apples or why mangoes taste good or why we think that some animals are more valuable than others, though it can help. So qualitative research is important. Embodied knowledge. So there's knowledge that we have that we just remember. If you ride a bicycle, every time you get on the bicycle, you don't have to try to learn it again. That memory is already in your body. Your muscles kind of know how to do it. They remember. This is not something we remember in our mind. This is something that we know and remember in our body. If you play an instrument, I play guitar, so I really appreciate those of you who have been playing. And if you play guitar, you know that after a while, you don't have to think, oh, where's that chord? Where's that C? Okay, this one, this one, this one. If you had to do that every time, you would never get through a song. But your fingers remember, so that you can get through a song. And if you play rhythm guitar and your hands, you begin to, so that you can do that rhythm, you don't have to think about it every time. It's the memory is in your body. So there are lots of ways that we know things. The scientific method is one of those ways, and it's an incredible way. But we know things through lots of ways. Communal knowledge, shared experiences. When we talk about cultural memory, we talk about genocides, we talk about people who maybe survived the Holocaust. There's a collective memory, there's a collective knowledge that happens with that. So storytelling is absolutely a valid form of knowledge production. We have methods for analyzing stories, for comparing stories, for talking with other people who do that kind of research and say, well, what do you think? Does this look like a good analysis? And they say, that's peer review, and they say, yes, that's good. So storytelling is important. When it comes to the flood, I think it's also important to think about how we would tell that story if a catastrophic flood happened today. How would we know? So I think in the beginning, if the rains began to be very heavy, we would begin to see it on our cell phones. We'd begin to hear it a little bit on our news. There seems to be a big flood going on. We've had a volcano erupt. That would begin to pop up. But then it would begin to overwhelm those systems as people began to have more and more. As the go back just one more again. As we thank you. As the flood began to grow, it would begin to take out power lines. Right, that's what happens with hurricanes and floods. It takes out our power lines. It takes out our power grids. The telephones would go down. Your internet would go down. Your phone would run out of battery. You'd stop getting the stories on social media. After a while, this is a satellite picture, actually, of a flood in the Indus River. So we'd begin to see from satellite. And finally, the only way to really verify in real time that a global flood was happening would maybe be a satellite image, right? We would have a satellite. Hopefully, there would be people around who would be there. But even if there was a human being in the space station with that satellite image, they wouldn't be able to send it to us. We would have no way of receiving it. If our phones were dead, and if the computer banks were down, and if the cities had begun to wash away, we would now have one person isolated out in space who could watch our Earth flooded and have no way of telling us. What kind of data would we be looking for if this kind of thing were happening now? So now for the next one, thank you. So what we would have is actually what we would have. What we have is what we would expect. We would expect to see, after the waters began to go down, we would expect to see pockets of survivors gathering together to salvage what they could. These are primarily pictures of people who were either through climate change, who are climate change refugees because of flooding, have had to flee where they were living, or who are moving across land or across water. We would find people gathering to tell these stories and to try to say, what happened to your family? Who did you lose? Where was your house? How did you get on the boat? What happened? We would expect these stories to be remembered and retold. We would expect these stories to be diverse. People in one area would have a different experience than people in another area. It would happen a little differently. And if the event was very significant, it would pass into legend or myth, being told long after the original storytellers had passed away. And as the waters go down, and as these people are no longer talking to these people, and these people are no longer talking to those people, and the great distance has separated us, and we haven't yet built up the technologies to communicate together, we might expect that people who have wandered far from the original story, or wandered far from the idea of a creative God, their story might begin to look very different. So global flood stories actually do conform to a pattern that we would expect from a large-scale catastrophic event impacting the lives of a diverse and separated but a large number of people. So when we see these flood stories, we have the single flood story coming from the Abrahamic traditions. But when we see these other flood stories around the world, that actually is what we would expect to see in this kind of event. So you can go ahead. World flood stories provide reliability to our analysis of the flood. We can see that while there are differences in mythology and cosmology meaning our ideas of how things came into being, yet accounts of a flood include common features and themes that remain intact. While Genesis provides a historical account of a global flood, flood stories around the world corroborate in poetic and mythical ways the central truth of a global flood. So this is evidence of a global flood that's not resting in the geology, although there's lots of evidence there. This is evidence of a global flood that's not resting in our genetic code or the codes of plants or animals. This is evidence of the flood that is resting in culture. It's resting in our shared memory. The presence of these stories is helpful in that it demonstrates a memory of the flood in the social and cultural memories of humans. So the last slide, I think. So telling these stories is important. We tell the Genesis story. We need to talk about other stories, but we have to talk about them in a culturally situated way, right? So anthropologically, telling these stories is a form of heritage preservation. It helps to keep these stories alive. They're actually important. We don't want them all erased. We don't want to replace them with our Abrahamic story. We want to lay them beside each other. So we want to hold on to them. We want to preserve that heritage, but it's also a part of racial reconciliation and historical reconciliation. To say that we don't have to cover the whole earth with a Western idea of the flood story. There's value in other people's stories and everyone else's stories as well. These are actually, they're important, they're meaningful, not just because they're meaningful to us, they're meaningful in their own right, but also to demonstrate again that they are meaningful. Now, recognizing and teaching Seventh-day Adventist faith is connected to the stories, beliefs, and histories, invites a broader view of the workings of God throughout human history and human social life, rather than viewing indigenous and native people as excluded from a knowledge of God and from his providence and working. We can recognize that God has left evidence of himself and of his work in their stories too. They're valuable. And so I find that particularly compelling as we think about global stories. So thank you so much.